talking about faces of survival, the faces of survival, the faces of survival. And we hit on initially on what would be the traditional ideas about what survival is. And, being alone in the wilderness, living off the land, that type of thing. And it's been popularized a lot recently in shows like Life Below Zero and Alone, which happen to be two of my favorites, and Outlast and, some other group type scenarios. But, the idea is that you're living in the wilderness and you're living off the land. And that is an example of a willing scenario. You're willing to be there. And, versus say you're walking through the woods, you're out camping, and you get separated from the group, and you end up off in the woods somewhere, and you don't know where you are. And there's been cases where people have been in plane crashes and survived, and have been in very remote, desolate places, and have had to survive and do some really unthinkable things to survive. And so there's a lot of different scenarios like that you could think about, and those would be unwilling scenarios. And then, of course, we have other scenarios where we have people who are battling addiction, people who are battling, significant illness that could be long-term, debilitating, or even terminal. We have homeless people. We have people living in toxic relationships, abusive relationships, and these are people who are surviving. And so this is what we want to talk about. So it goes beyond the more traditional willing scenarios and even the more traditional unwilling scenarios of being lost in the wilderness. We're looking at also scenarios where people are facing really extraordinary circumstances and surviving. And that's kind of where I see our podcast going, the direction that I see it going.
And one of the kind of running thoughts that I have about your willing and unwilling participants of survival has to do with the distinction between anxiety and fear, where fear is a defined or known entity. So like fear of the dark or fear of heights, people facing people's fears in those survival kinds of shows. Mm-hmm. And anxiety being something undefined, something people don't know. So somebody, going through cancer treatment or that kind of thing, they're not sure what are the possible outcomes. I mean, they know some of the possible outcomes, they're just not sure which one is the one that they're going to, they're not sure which scenario is the one that they're living. So, yeah, there's a difference between facing the fears and dealing with anxiety, especially long term. And there's a lot of people where that's the exact diagnosis that they get is anxiety.
Yeah, I don't think people look at it that way. I don't, that's a really good and distinction, fear and anxiety. Fear being known, anxiety being unknown. And so I suspect that our willing participants in these reality shows and other type of events where people willingly put themselves in those survival situations, they're facing their fears. They're facing our fears. They're facing everybody's fears, but they're facing what is essentially known fears versus the person who's been lost in the woods is an unwilling participant, and they don't know what they're looking at. And it's the same. Pretty much just about every other situation, survival situation that we've talked about, cancer survivors, people who are living in toxic relationships, and the homeless, and the many, many different scenarios that we can think of. These people are facing the unknown, and that's where anxiety comes in. And so that's a very good distinction and fits very well with what we're trying to do here, I think, with this podcast. One of the things that I see us doing in the future with the sequence of the episodes as we release them would probably be to start in the more traditional sense. I think that's what people are going to initially relate to because of what we've been seeing in reality TV, and they might find interesting from the perspective of some folks who have been out there doing it. We've talked about people who have been, in those plane crashes and had to live under extraordinary circumstances and really do in some cases, some unspeakable things to survive. And there's a lot of scenarios like that, and I want to capture some of those. But those are the got lost scenarios, or there was an accident scenario. But more and more, we will begin to talk about the things that I think maybe some people don't want to hear. And in some cases, the things that are hard to hear, the things that people are living. And we have to present this in a way that people can relate to. Because I really believe that, if we're sending the right message in each of the scenarios that we discuss, that it could save somebody's life, somebody that's going through similar scenarios. So in the beginning, we'll kind of lay out our description of the many different phases of survival, and then we'll progress into the willing and then into the unwilling, and move in how we see it in a traditional sense to maybe some of the ways that we may not want to see it.
All right.
So that's kind of my plan going forward.
I'm Sarah Darville.
And I'm Ken Darville, and this is Zodiac.